All right. Hello, everyone. We are in finally for the second week for the month of December, which is probably going to be our second to last video of the year. But this will be our last video before the Christmas holiday. So for this week's topic, it's not going to be the longest of videos, probably going to be relatively short compared to what we normally do here. But we are going to go ahead and for this week, I decided to take a look at the origins of a very famous, obviously, Christmas figure that is very prominent at this time of year, Santa Claus. We are going to take a look at the historical backtrack for where does the idea and modern depiction of Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas come from? Because obviously, spoiler alert for anyone that's not a child, obviously, most of us that have grown up realize the truth. And children are still inclined to their beliefs and can be as well. But for the origins of Santa Claus, he's not exact. I would say that the modern iteration is very much more within the last 200 years, whereas the idea as a whole goes back a lot farther than what I think a lot of us take credit and even really appreciate for. So, for the origin of Santa Claus, for the very first origin, of course, where does the name of Saint Nicholas come from? Because most people will argue, Santa Claus is based off a real person that did exist, and that is true. He is based off an actual real life person, and that was Saint Nicholas. And Saint Nicholas we can get his life all the way back to the 3rd century AD, so back at the time that even Rome is still kind of in power. Saint Nicholas was born near the town, what is now the town of Myra in Turkey, around 280 AD. He would give away all his wealth that he had inherited. He had been born into a very wealthy family and inherited a lot of money upon the death of a lot of his fellow family members, including that of his parents. But he decided to give all of the material riches of life away that he inherited, and instead decided to travel the countryside in order to help the poor and the ill and any of the destitute that he found. A very famous story involving Saint Nicholas involved him saving three poor sisters from being sold pretty much into slavery at the time. Now, the three sisters' father had been threatening to sell them into slavery or prostitution, and the sisters very uh what would be the word here? Very expectantly did not want to go into slavery. It was a very not or it didn't want to be prostitutes. That's a hard life. That's a dangerous life that can end up in their death. And obviously they didn't want to go into that. And St. Nicholas had come upon them. He learned of their situation, and the story goes that he ended up providing the sisters with a dowry, some sort of a money payment, so that these three sisters could afford to get married and thus escape the control of their father, who intended to sell them into either prostitution or into enslavement. The legend of Saint Nicholas would actually end up growing after his death. So during the time of Saint Nicholas, when he's alive, during the 3rd century AD, he's not exactly the well-known figure that he is now. And it's only after his death that the legend of his life and the legend of what he was really starts coming about. Now, mind you, we're not saying that St. Nicholas was the Santa Claus of today. We're not saying he rode around in a sleigh with 8 reindeer and gave toys to children around the world. But what he does share in common is he is known as the protector saint of children and sailors, and that's what he becomes known for, mostly of children. He's the patron saint of children. And his feast day would be celebrated on December 6th of each year, which was the day of his death. The feast day of St. Nicholas eventually became kind of a traditional day of good luck toward the end of the year. Toward the end of the year, when December comes around, it was kind of this traditional day to get together with friends and family and celebrate good fortune and good luck. And it was kind of a positive thing at the very end of the year to have this celebration. Because Christmas back then was solely kind of a Christian thing. Not a whole lot of people celebrated Christmas unless they were of the Christian faith, and even then, Christmas has gone through a few iterations itself as to when it was celebrated and how it was celebrated, which that could be a whole nother video if we went into it. But During the feast day of Saint Nicholas, it was also very common for people growing up after his death and learning of the legend. It was very common that on the feast day of Saint Nicholas that you would go out and make large purchases or get married on December 6th because this was a very special and lucky day. This was supposed to bring you good fortune, and thus, if you're going to, get married or make a big purchase, you probably want luck to be on your side and not come to regret it. So why not do it on what is considered to be one of the luckiest days of the calendar year? Nicholas's popularity in Europe post-Reformation allowed him to actually maintain a very positive reputation despite other saints having been discouraged. If we can recall, the Reformation comes about in the 1500s, and this is where a lot of the Protestant branches of Christianity come out. They come out, break away from the authority of the Catholic Church because they disagree with the Catholic Church, a little bit with the Eastern Orthodox as well, the Greek Orthodox, as we might also call them, but it's mostly with the Catholic. It's a break with Catholicism and how the Catholic Church is basically the practices of the Catholic Church, the way that they interpret scripture. There's just differences that come about over the centuries since the fall of the Roman Empire that by the 1500s in Europe have now come to a head. And by the time of the Reformation, when this comes about, a lot of these new Protestant branches, such as the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, they're not really, and even the Anabaptists, Baptists, Anabaptists, what would become the Amish and all that, all the Protestant branches as a whole. When the Reformation starts, they absolutely do not want almost anything to do with Catholicism. They get rid of church iconography. They get rid of, I'm trying to think of what the word was here. I can't even think of the word right now. I know it's on the top of my tongue, but the payments that the church would have, that if you gave a payment to the church, they basically would forgive you of a sin, supposedly. The Protestant branches did not believe in that. They thought that was blasphemous against what the Bible taught. So a lot of the Protestant branches, when they break off, they want nothing to do with Catholic practices and Catholic rituals and Catholic iconography, and they get rid of a lot of the stuff that's associated with that, including a lot of the so-called Christian saints, because those are traditionally identified with the Catholic Church. St. Nicholas was an exception. There were a few saints that the Protestant branches did not seem to have a problem with, and St. Nicholas was one of those rare exceptions where they did not seem to have a problem with that saint in particular. So St. Nicholas, despite the fact that Protestant branches are not coming out against the Catholic Church in the 1500s and the 16th century Europe, he still maintains a very wide popularity. And this popularity that he already had before the Reformation may have been what kind of allowed him to persevere through it and afterward, even in the Protestant branches of Christianity. And he became a very especially popular saint in Holland, which is now the Netherlands. So so again, kind of also tying in with last week a little bit too, because basis for the American basis for what we know as Santa Claus in North America actually comes from a Dutch version of St. Nicholas. And last week we discussed Dutch colonialism in North America, mostly around the New York region, around New York City. And this kind of also ties into that because that same region can kind of be traced as to where the idea of Santa Claus comes over into North America, which we'll see here very shortly. And this is an image. We don't have a whole lot of images today, but this is a traditional image of Saint Nicholas of Myra, the patron saint of children. This is the guy that is the original origin for the term of Saint Nicholas. He's the one that supposedly, Santa Claus is based off of originally. A man that basically was born into wealth, born into money, gave it all up to go roam the countryside and help those more poor, destitute, or ill than he was. So that brings us to the legend of what we call Sinter Klaus, or or that is where Santa Claus is going to end up coming from. And now Sinter Klaus is the Dutch iteration. He's a Dutch interpretation of Saint Nicholas, and he would start to come about to America, at least. I mean, we could talk about the Dutch aspect as well, but we're going to talk about it in the context of North America because that is where the idea of Santa Claus comes from. St. Nicholas would start to become a part of American popular culture in about the 18th century, so the 1700s, right toward the end of the colonial period. Dutch colonists in New York, as we mentioned in the last video, the Dutch had colonized the area of the Hudson River Valley in New Jersey. They had eventually been taken over by the English, but the Dutch colonists still remained. They didn't exactly lose everything. They didn't exactly move just because the English took over or anything. They maintained some control. So the Dutch colonists in New York had brought over these legends of Sinterklaas, or Saint Nicholas, as they would know him as. It was just an iteration they had in their own culture of Santa Claus. And Sinter Klaas is going to be the basis for where Santa Claus comes from. Now, the Dutch families in New York, even after independence has been gained from Britain, the Dutch families would often gather to celebrate St. Nicholas's feast day every December 6th, which would often attract other New York residents who were kind of perturbed by this very homely ritual every year that they seen these Dutch families having. Of these Dutch ethnicity families were having these big get togethers on December 6th. They're going out and making big purchases. They're going out and getting married, and they kind of observing this like, "What is this? Like, what are they doing?" Because at first, it was curious to them. It was an absolutely foreign concept to them. They weren't a majority of Americans in New York were not Catholic at that time because Catholics were often persecuted by the English, and thus they were never really appreciated by the English in large part. But in New York, when you have these Dutch settlers coming in, it's kinda odd for them because they're seeing this new tradition that they are not familiar with, and thus it grabs the public's attention. It grabs the public attention in New York toward this Saint Nicholas's feast day, and then they start wondering, "Who is this Saint Nicholas or Sinter Klaas," as the Dutch are referring to him? Who is this man that they keep showing and dressing up as around the holiday and dedicating the day to? So in 1804, John Pintard, who was a member of the New York Historical Society, would actually help to distribute woodcuts of St. Nicholas at the annual meeting of the society. The woodcuts would actually feature background engravings of Santa like depictions, which stockings full of gifts, which is partly where that tradition would come from. So the tradition is starting to grow in New York, and the New York Historical Society actually goes along with this and starts distributing woodcut depictions of the Dutch version of Saint Nicholas, of Sinterklaas, to the wider population because not everyone that was part of the New York Historical Society was of Dutch descent, and that starts getting a little bit wider recognition. And this, for reference, this is what an image, I mean, it's a modern day image but depiction from the Netherlands, but this is what Sinterklaas generally looks like when they show him over in the Netherlands. He's not quite Santa Claus, but you can definitely see some similarities. The white beard, the old portly man figure, the red in his clothing, not necessarily the fur-lined cap and clothes, but very similar in terms of just general appearance. Washington Irving would help to further popularize the idea of Sinterklaas in stories in 1809 with his book The History of New York, where he would refer to Sinterklaas as the patron saint of New York. Because to many New Yorkers, they wanted something to take after the American War of Independence, after the American Revolution, they wanted to kind of distance themselves from Great Britain as much as possible. They didn't want to be seen as just an offshoot of the English race. They wanted to be seen as something unique and total on their own. And a lot of New Yorkers did turn when they were discussing their history, would turn toward the factor that they had once been, in large part, a Dutch colony and thus had not always been English. They kind of pointed to that as evidence that, hey, we are unique in our own way. We're not just an offshoot of the English. We are a mix of the English and the Dutch settlers who preceded them here. And thus, we're culturally different. And thus, since Santa Claus came from that original Dutch heritage, it was something that a lot of New Yorkers wanted to kind of embrace as a part of their non English heritage that would set them apart from those that came from England. Now, Santa Claus was not yet our modern Santa in most depictions that he was coming about as in the late 18th, early 19th century. He was described as many things. He was described as being a rascal with a blue tricorn hat, a red waistcoat, and yellow stockings. Not quite the Santa Claus that we often picture today, where he's got the big black belt buckle, he's got the boots on, he's got the red coat with the white fur trim, he's got the hat on, not quite the look that we imagine for Santa Claus now, but similar. And he was also often described as a man wearing a broad brimmed hat and a huge pair of Flemish trunk hose, some kind of a trouser at the time. It was one of the two defining events for the final depiction of Santa Claus is going to come out is going to be in the 19th century. One in the very first half of it. The second won't come until about the time right around the time of the Civil War and mostly right after it. And the first very definitive part of the legend of Santa Claus, of which terms we start to really Americanize the character of Sinter Klaas, is going to come about in 1822. Mind you, in 1809, Washington Irving had portrayed Santa Claus as the patron saint of the state of New York due to its Dutch heritage. And as recently as 1809, it's still being referred to as Santa Claus. There is no Santa Claus. It is not till 1822, roughly almost a little over 10 years, a little over maybe 12 or 13 years down the road, that this ends up changing. Because in 1822, an Episcopal minister named Clement Clark Moore would write a very famous Christmas poem for his three daughters at the time. He originally had entitled the poem, and its original name was An Account of a Visit from Saint Nicholas, but the common world, moreover, today and at the time gradually got to know it and knows it still as Twas the Night Before Christmas, which is probably the most famous Christmas story ever told to children around the holidays, of the story of Santa Claus coming down the chimney, coming in his sleigh with his 8 reindeer, and everyone knows the story. You've learned it since you were a toddler. Well, this poem didn't exist until 1822, and when this poem comes out, when "Twas the Night Before Christmas" is published, it becomes an instant American classic, mostly because of the depiction it gives of Santa Claus slash Saint Nicholas, and it's among one of the first pieces of American literature to refer to him not as Santa Claus, but as Santa Claus, which is kind of an Americanization of the Dutch name. The poem has come to define the modern image of Santa Claus that many of us have. It gave Santa Claus his white beard, his red nose, his hat and sack of toys, his kind of portly look where he's kind of, a little chubby. We all know Santa's got a big old belly. We all know he's got a little bit of weight to him. It is the first depiction of Santa Claus to depict these things. It also is the first to kind of introduce the concept that Santa Claus comes down chimneys and puts I mean, we already had the concept of him putting gifts away in stockings, but now we have the concept of him going up and down chimneys in order to get into the houses. And it is the first piece of American literature to ever name Santa's 8 reindeer, his 8 original reindeer. Because mind you, Rudolph don't exist yet. Rudolph the ninth reindeer is not going to come about until the early 20th century, and another classic story that would end up coming about. At the time, Quest the Night Before Christmas is the first depiction to say that Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus comes to a house, and he comes to a house pretty much on this magical sleigh that flies with these 8 reindeer that fly, hauling the thing. So it is really the first thing that gets about a modern iteration of what we know as Santa Claus. Now, if I can recall from the night before Christmas, not Quest the Night Before Christmas poem, I don't think it ever explicitly refers to him as Santa Claus, but I do believe it used the more common referral name of Saint Nick or Saint Nicholas. But the concept is laid for the modern interpretation. The image of Santa, what that Moore's poem produced, would popularize the character even further. By the 1840s, in certain cities around the holidays, certain cities were actually putting up like giant statues of a depiction of St. Nicholas for the kids to come see. And this became a gradual holiday tradition. By the time of the late 19th century, we have probably the final piece of the puzzle that's going to paint the modern depiction for Santa Claus, and that is the depiction of famous American political cartoonist Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast worked for the Harper's Weekly. Well, it got published in Harper's Weekly. His cartoons would often be published in Harper's Weekly, which was a popular newspaper at the time, and he also worked for the Courier and Ives printing company, which, if you ever listen to some Christmas songs, they might refer to Courier and Ives. That is where that kind of comes from, is because Thomas Nast is the first guy to really popularize the image, the classic image that we have nowadays of what Santa Claus actually looks like. And he takes a lot of his inspiration for his depiction from the Twas the Night Before Christmas poem that had been written back in 1822. And it was Thomas Nast's depictions of Santa Claus which ingrained the image of Santa into the American consciousness, and that image has largely persevered almost unchanged to this very day. He is the one that is responsible for giving Santa the bright red suit trimmed with the white fur. He is also responsible for stating getting the into the legend of there that Santa Claus has a workshop at the North Pole. He's the one that introduces the elves who work under him and make all the toys and the gifts that he gives the kids on Christmas Eve night. And he is the one responsible for providing the first caricature of Mrs. Claus. All of that is introduced by Nast, who, mind you, is a political cartoonist. Nast is into the business of making fun of politics. He's also the one responsible, coincidentally, for coming up with the elephant as symbol of the Republican Party. He depicted a lot of his political cartoons. He would depict the GOP or the Grand Old Party, where that name comes from. It was so large in power at the time that he depicted the GOP as like this massive elephant for its size and for its strength at the time that he was a political cartoonist. And mind you, he starts this is about the 1870s, 1860s, 1880s that Nast is portraying and writing in Harper's Weekly and putting these images out. But yeah, he's also responsible for that. And in terms, this is actually one of the classic Nast images of Santa Claus as he depicted. And this occurred during the middle of the Civil War in 1863, but this very much to almost any person in the United States, if you looked at this, you wouldn't even have to have a name on this thing. If you asked, who do you think this is? Most people would be able to identify, oh, that's Santa Claus, because that is Santa Claus. This is the modern iteration that Nast gave us. Now, mind you, he's not wearing his hat here, but he has a lot of his other things. He has the big red suit on. He's, of course, a little plump. He's got toys and he's got a sack on. Well, not maybe a sack, but some sort of a backpack to carry them. He's got the big old white beard, the rosy cheeks and nose, and he's even got a little pipe that he's looks like he's smoking something out of. But this is one of the first caricatures of the modern Santa Claus that comes about. So by the late 19th century, Santa Claus has come about from Sinter Klaas, and he has become a part of American popular culture. By the 20th century, you start seeing Santa Claus everywhere. You see him in magazines around the holidays. You see him at malls, at shopping centers. People dressed up as Santa Claus in order to, provide the parents with taking their kids to the mall. Get their kids into the shopping space. What do? You put someone dressed up as Santa in order to kind of get the parents to bring their children instead of having to worry about leaving them at home. You see Santa Claus on Christmas decor, you see him in Christmas songs, you see him in films that start coming about. It just explodes in the 20th century. But the modern depiction can trace its roots back to two main things. It can trace its roots back to the Courier and Ives descriptions, the Courier and Ives lithographs and pictures that Thomas Nast was putting in back in the late 19th century, and it can trace even a little even further back to the 1822 classic story of Twas the Night Before Christmas, which gives us our first iteration of the character in the modern sense. So, again, like I said, not not exactly the longest video. I'm not aiming for a long video here. I just wanted to do a general thing of where exactly did this idea of Santa Claus come from. So we went from being Saint Nicholas of Myra in Turkey to this Christian saint, the patron saint of children. Then we went to a Dutch iteration and interpretation of that character who's brought over here by Dutch colonists to the United States, what will become the United States. And then the United States, the Americans kind of take Sinter Claus, adopt him as their own in a way, and then Americanize him into what we know today, which is Santa Claus. So that will conclude for this video. Again, not the longest. We're just aiming for a general overview. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything they'd like to add or anything like that, feel free to put that in the comment section and I'll get to them when I can. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is our last video here before the Christmas holiday. So, because Christmas is next Wednesday, it's hard to believe it's already right upon us. So, obviously, I don't know if I'm going to do a video next week. I'm still debating if it's going to be next week or if I'm going to try to do it on the Monday or Tuesday before December ends, before New Year's Day. So we will have one more video this month. It's just a question, will I get to it next week with the holiday stuff going on, or is it going to kind of be like right at the very end of the month on either that Monday or Tuesday, so either the 30th or the 31st? So one of the two it would be, but we will have one more video this month, and that would be our president video for the month. So that concludes for today's video. So if anyone hopefully everyone has a good holiday coming up. So hopefully everyone stays safe. Hopefully everyone enjoys all the food, all the getting together with family, all the festivities that come with the Christmas holiday. I know all the children, the one thing they look to is gifts. They don't exactly always realize that giving and being with family is probably the much greater gift of the holiday season. And they won't realize that until they're older. Most children don't. But hopefully everyone has a good Christmas Eve, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when that comes out.